All right, and I do apologize if anyone was looking forward to fancy backgrounds. Um, I'm going pretty simple here just because depending on what computer settings you have, it makes things easier to see sometimes. I found some great um, Islamic tessellated images and I put them behind some of the slides and realized that you couldn't see anything or read anything, and that probably wasn't a good layout. So sort of as a blanket start, just as a historian, I don't have um, uh, it's not rights that I'm looking for here, but I don't have authorization for these images. I believe pretty much every image or map that I have here is open access, but I just wanted to throw out there that if, particularly in recordings, if anyone is ever concerned, I can always come in and change images or make the proper attributions. So just to put the sort of official piece out there beforehand. All right, so if we're going to talk about Richard and Saladin and the Crusades, one of the sort of important pieces that we have to set before we sort of have the conversation is what our frame of reference is and how we're going to consider some of the pieces. And it's really important with something like the Crusades because of the theological component. So in discussing Saladin and discussing Richard and their actions and their beliefs, I'm going to be looking at it from the perspective of a historian rather than as a theologist. I'm not making judgment calls based on either of either Christianity or Islam as part of this conversation. Both of these individuals during their times were held up as models of their respective faiths, and both of them also were challenged as to their devotion to their faiths at particular times. So it's important to understand them as historical people and to understand that they lived in their own belief sets and that these are connected to modern religions, but it's really can get to be thin ice when we're looking at historical individuals, when we're talking about clashes of religion in history and sort of applying a modern religious lens to it. So just wanted to put that out there to keep in the back of everyone's minds. We could have a very deep and rich conversation about the challenges and conflicts that modern Christianity and modern Islam have, but that doesn't really necessarily apply to the 12th century, if that makes any sense. At any point during this, if you have any questions, well, I've got the slides up. I can't see the chat function, but if anybody, wants to put something in chat and someone else just wants to let me know that it's there, that's perfectly fine. I welcome questions at any point because this conversation about the Third Crusade and Richard and Saladin could go a couple of different directions. Whether we're talking about the Holy Land during the medieval period and the sort of political and military intrigue going on there, whether we're looking at it as a sort of leadership or character study between Richard and Saladin, whether we're focusing on sort of Richard as a person and his formative life and how that created the medieval king he was. All of these are sort of various tracks that we could follow. So if you're interested in anything particular, just let me know. And I'm happy to sort of walk down that path in a little bit more detail. For those that are interested here in our imagery in the background, anybody identify these two buildings?
Sure. It's the Holy Sepulchre Church. I'm sorry, I mispronounced.
No, no worries.
And of course, the main, in the place of the Solomon Temple, it was built I forgot the name, the mosque, I forgot the name of it.
Alexa.
In English,
yeah, that's right. That's right. Yes.
Absolutely. And these are two landmarks that would have been certainly, they certainly existed at the time of the Crusades. Obviously, there have been changes and restoration work and various additions over the years. But I thought they were very illustrative of the hotbed of tension that in many ways Jerusalem still can be in our modern eyes today. All right, so let's sort of set our stage in the Holy Land, the Levant in 1150, what's going on. So the Crusader states, as they become known, five different counties or principalities or kingdoms, depending how they're formed, they have different rulers and get different names, were almost suffer from their own success in the terms of their creation. So the First Crusade, which is almost a century predating the events we're really going to focus in on this conversation, I think the only people who might not have been surprised by its success were the Western Crusaders themselves, who are pretty much universally known at the time as the Franks, a term that still gets used for European Crusaders in the Middle East throughout the entire crusading period, especially in conversations with they would call it the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, as it's usually referred to by Westerners, and the various Islamic states as well. About the only, the various stages that were required to click almost perfectly for the First Crusade to be successful were almost miraculous. And certainly the Crusaders themselves saw it as being so. But it left the various entities that were created out of it in a very awkward position politically, militarily, and even as communities, because there never were a huge number of Western Crusaders in the Holy Land. The vast majority of the population were not. They were either they were certainly native to the region. Many of them were certainly Muslim. Many of them were what we would call today Eastern Orthodox. But they're ruled by a relatively small ruling class of Western leaders who very quickly acclimate into the societies that they essentially take over in the First Crusade. And so one of the things that is very common is intermarriage, particularly in the early generations into the Eastern Orthodox, into the Christians who had been living, communities who had been living in the area long before the First Crusaders arrived. But it leaves them very, very fragile to conflict, particularly with their neighbors, both the Byzantine Empire, and there's a very healthy amount of conflict between the Byzantine Empire and the Crusader states, particularly in the area of Edessa and Antioch, but also with their Islamic neighbors surrounding them. And probably the only reason that the Crusader states, and particularly Jerusalem, stand in Western Christian hands for so long is that not only were they divided sort of amongst themselves, but that the various communities and principalities in the Islamic world surrounding them were also incredibly divided. And it took quite a long time for various leaders to sort of pull these communities together and create enough power to successfully drive the Western Crusaders out, particularly of Jerusalem. And we'll talk a little bit about the ebb and flow in some of the areas as this goes on. But that's very slow in coming, and largely a product of the leadership of Saladin, who manages to do an excellent job of pulling together these various different, sort of city-states, caliphates, and community areas that were not united in a real concrete sense before he started to pull them together. It was the very fact that there was so much disunion and so much conflict that allowed the First Crusade to be successful when it was. So the First Crusade manages to capture this swath of territory along the Mediterranean coast, by and large. It is shortly followed by a Second Crusade, which is not terribly successful. There's a challenge as Crusaders get involved and attempt to sort of continue this mission that they feel they've been given by the Pope. There's the challenge becomes first of all, how do you get there to begin with, particularly with large armies? Logistics are not necessarily the strong suit of a lot of medieval leaders. Medieval armies are not created in a way that has an organized logistical component the way that we would think of it today. And so it's a challenge to keep these armies supplied and moving. The general concept is, well, we'll just buy what we need as we go, but that requires the nobility, who are the leaders of these expeditions, to carry huge amounts of gold. And there's no such thing as paper money. You'll start to see with agencies like the Templars, almost a form of banking being created simply because of the need of some way of controlling capital in these large armies that are moving across the country. But just the sheer amount of hard currency that would need to be carried to purchase food and things of that nature is a burden in and of itself. And then you add on to that the fact that, all right, even if you have enough gold, is the region you're moving through going to have enough produce, enough forage, enough food and supplies to even be able to purchase it in the first place? And no Crusader army, with the possible exception of Philip and Richard's forces in the Third Crusade, do a particularly good job of handling their logistics. The First Crusade gets through the Byzantine Empire, but not without conflicts with with Emperor Constantine. Or it's not. Who is it? I blanked out on his name.
Alexis.
Alexis, thank you. End up in conflict with Alexis over just the matter of food. There's towns that are sacked by the Crusader forces moving through simply because they need the supplies. They need food and forage for their animals, which are not, at that point they had run out of anything they could possibly try to bring with them. One of the reoccurring themes in the First Crusade is the sheer overwhelming concern for horses. Particularly war horses, who are the foundation of the combat style of Western knights. And it is largely probably true that the army that fights around Jerusalem at the end of the First Crusade is largely an infantry force and has learned vastly different methods of conflict than they would have left Europe with, simply because they no longer have the horses that they had depended on to that point. So all of these factors come into play into making a very tenuous grip by the Crusader states in the Holy Land. Despite that, they are surprisingly tenacious, and there's quite a few reasons for that. And one of them is the divisions in the Islamic world itself. I mean, look, you have certainly the divisions of Sunni and Shiite Islam, which are create distrust and problems, particularly between Egypt and Damascus, which are sort of the two sort of power bases. We can't talk of these regions in the terms of modern states today, but
which one is Shia?
So Damascus would be Shiite and Egypt would be Sunni, I believe. And there's a lot of, but there's also a lot of give and take and interplay between the two regions because we're relatively early in the split between Sunni and Shiite. So just as we would look at Western Europe and see Western Europe at the time of the Crusades as being very fractured and a lot of conflict between regions that might largely appear similar, you have much the same going on in the Middle East between these various elements. And sort of add on to that, that both our two primary forces here have very different styles of combat. Western Europeans, by and large, are still focused on the idea of the heavy cavalry mounted charge, using specially trained and increasingly specially bred war horses for that purpose. There is quite a push and quite a lot of trade in getting horses into the Holy Land to supply Western knights. The traditional form of warfare, particularly from the northern regions, the Seljuk Turks, and latterly through the more southern and eastern Arabic regions, is light cavalry forces, which rely on hit and run attacks, feigned flights, use of showers of arrows and mounted bowmen as sort of their primary tactical focus. There's a growing sort of heavy cavalry force that starts to build in Egypt that will eventually turn into what in following crusades will be thought of as the Ghulams or the Mamluks. We're just sort of at the start of some of those it's not a caste system as we would identify it, but it is very much a unique culture within Egypt itself to the concept of the Mamluk warriors. So what you end up having are Western forces that very much depend on the strike of heavy cavalry, with Eastern forces who are very flexible and are sort of hard to pin down by their Western opponents. And it's finding the balance between the two that are going to lead any military leader in the Holy Land to victory. If a Western force can catch an Eastern force in a place where they cannot easily withdraw or catch them by surprise, and they have the mounted cavalry for that heavy cavalry charge, they will probably be successful. If an Islamic force can manage to have the space and the timing to focus on its hit and run attacks, then it will probably be more successful. And then add on to that simply that any Islamic leader that can pull together a large force from these various communities is going to be able to vastly outnumber any Crusader force that is able to be put into the field. One sort of additional element that sort of bears mentioning at least a little bit here and will become kind of important in particularly when we're looking at Richard and his sort of final approach toward Jerusalem is the Holy Orders, the Templars and the Hospitallers, who are essentially try to marry Western knightly traditions with those of monasticism. And what they end up forming are well-funded, well-equipped professional military forces. The Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller exist as military organizations that have the freedom and the flexibility to train, to garrison, and to practice war without worrying about things like running estates or managing communities or doing anything other than being prepared for the defense of the Holy Land. Now, both the Templar and the Hospitaller organizations have other jobs as well, but their military side is really just focused on those military tasks. One of the sort of side effects of this, and it particularly becomes true in the case of the Templars, is they essentially create one of the first banking systems because they accept donations from across Europe. And so they have large funds in Europe, but they also have large, stores of funds and defensive positions in the Holy Land. And because there's this communication between them in controlling their own logistical and economic systems, eventually it will get to be that a Western knight can essentially make a deposit at their local Templar chapter and then will be given documentation that then they can take to the Holy Land and draw on those funds from the various Templar fortresses in the eastern regions as well. So essentially creating an early banking system, although it doesn't last necessarily particularly long. So the last sort of piece to touch on here is the concept of jihad, which doesn't mean in 1150 necessarily what we would think of it as meaning today. If you go to sort of the root of the term, it is struggle, and it is applied in Islam as both the idea of a personal struggle in terms of your faith, as well as a struggle without. And a lot of the conflict that is tapped into in this idea of jihad in the sort of early period leading up to the rise of Saladin is within or between the various Islamic communities in terms of sort of, pulling them together under one person that is going to sort of chart the path for the religion and the society as a whole. Saladin is going to be in many ways responsible for starting to apply it toward the outside as well, particularly toward the Crusaders. And he's going to very successfully use the concept to fuel his own actions. And that's one thing that both Richard and Saladin do very, very well and are forced to do in their, for lack of a better term, early careers, is they're more focused on the conflicts with their neighbors and with their own communities, kingdoms, realms, than in conflict on the outside. And they are only going to start to focus on that outside conflict later in their reigns, and as later issues become more important, or sort of they're called on to do these various pieces. So that's sort of, I know it's a bit of a longer backstory, but sort of sets the scene for what's going on in this part of the world in about 1150. Are there any questions or comments or?
Yeah, Andrew, it's Ava. There seem to be a lot of people doing a lot of different things in different organizations.
Oh, yes. We don't, I mean, there isn't the sort of pulled together solidity of communities or nations as we would think of it today in either the Middle East or in Western Europe. You're at this point in history, you're starting to see what we would think of as those nation states begin, as opposed to kingdoms just under the control of a particularly charismatic leader. Or we're starting to see systems that pull together and create their own longer term existing region that has characteristics in government and things that we would recognize as a nation today. One of the reasons why, I mean, all these First Crusaders come over and they're all working for the same thing, which is the liberation of the Holy Land, which may not necessarily be what they were all working for. And yet we get 5 fractured Crusader states out of it, because you have personality conflicts and you have individuals that are directly opposed to other individuals. And so why is Antioch a principality? Well, because the knight or the lord who ends up controlling that region called himself a prince. Why is Edessa only a county? Well, because he called himself a count. He was a little bit more modest. The same thing with Tripoli. The same thing originally true of Jerusalem. When Jerusalem is originally taken over in the First Crusade, the belief is that there can only be one king of Jerusalem, and that is Jesus Christ. And so we're not going to name it a kingdom. That falls within 1 or 2 generations. They kind of lose the script there and are okay with it being a kingdom after that. But you're absolutely right. Richard and Saladin are able to be successful in the Holy Land, in the Third Crusade, vastly different degrees of success because they are able to pull together largely disparate groups. Richard is not able to keep them together. And Saladin, you might make the argument, isn't either, but his falls apart more slowly.
Well, in that regard, Andrew, a quick question.
Yes.
So, I mean, 2 questions. One is on Saladin, as we know he was an Arab, right? How he was able to bring, the Arab nation. Maybe you'll get to that. So maybe I'm jumping ahead.
You're leading me right into my next piece. So.
I'm sorry. And then
perfect.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No. What was the second question?
Second question is, in respect to, Templars and the banks. And obviously, this is the Third Crusade, so I'm sure that's already been established. But as we know, when Richard was leaving, England or whatnot, he almost took like 14,000 pounds or something like that, almost bankrupted England. There was
yes,
hundreds of pounds of cheese, and he took a lot of bacon with him. Like the guy stacked like he was going to Siberia.
Yes, and I mean, there's a tax imposed called the Saladin tax, simply for from England and the areas under Richard's rule, just to try to bankroll this expedition.
Andrew?
Yes.
2 questions on the map, if you don't mind. One, what is this Principality of Armenian Cilicia? And it sounds weird because I know Armenians are scattered throughout the region, but Armenia itself is well off to the northeast. And the second question, is the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum the same as the Great Seljuk Empire?
You might have me on the second question. I'm hesitant. My knowledge, particularly of the various Islamic states, is mostly as pertains to their relationship to the Crusaders. It's just not my area of specialty, and so I'm hesitant to sort of trace the various paths. I believe one sort of merged and formed into the other, and a lot of these have various different names. But I don't want to,
That's right.
Sort of make any missteps there. It's unfortunately, it's just not my sort of deep area of specialty. As far as the sort of Armenian connection, that in terms of a cultural group, there's sort of widespread Armenian settlement, and I don't have the dates off the top of my head, but they're sort of divided and split up by the Seljuk Turk invasion before the First Crusade. And so it would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 1000, because that also forms sort of a, one of the reasons the First Crusade is relatively successful is that the Seljuk Turks are relatively reasonably newcomers to the region when they move in. And so there's a lot of disunion and conflict that they're able to sort of capitalize on. So I think that's why you see some of those regions who were able to sort of reestablish. It's hard because we don't have terms for things that aren't countries. They're not, they're either principalities or caliphates, or they're named for their leaders. But they're widely varied in terms of naming conventions. But these various states are sort of created out of that turmoil and that conflict.
If I could also add here, prior to the Seljuk invasion in 11th century, there was an Armenian Empire in a way. It was Armenian kingdom that basically was spanning from this area of Cilicia all the way to the Caucasus Mountains. It was like the whole that big part of that area was Armenian kingdom, and it was split apart because of the Turkish invasion, and that's why this Armenian principality remained. And apparently, because they're Christian, they're left untouched by the Crusaders.
Yeah, the Crusaders and the Armenian communities within the Crusader states get along very, very well, actually. And they're particularly in the First Crusade, there's a lot of effort to sort of court the local Armenian communities by the First Crusaders to essentially because they need the partially because of the commonalities of religion and the idea of a shared enemy, but also from a practical sense, we need some support and some friends in a very distant land to help us to be able to survive. And there are ties, there's a lot of intermarriage.
I also understand that in the First Crusade, especially the Byzantines participated as well. They sent the contingents there, right?
Yes. So I don't want to, I mean, you could get me on the First Crusade and we'd use up all our time and never move on. Okay. In short, it is the need of the Byzantine Empire, or at least the request to the Western Christian Church for some support that is one of the things that generates the First Crusade. However, what the Byzantines really wanted was probably a couple of hundred trained warriors, and what they got was essentially a mass migration. And so the Byzantine Empire Alexis is very ginger in how he treats the Crusaders as they appear. And he's helped by the fact that, and we'll see this in the Third Crusade as well, no crusading force arrives in the Holy Land whole and together. They come in over long periods of time. For no other reason than they set off at different times, and you're limited in the number of the size of a force that can move through a region without completely draining it of everything. And so he is very judicious in playing the various Crusader leaders off of each other. So none of them necessarily has too much power. He promises them support, but it's at least initially not the direct support they're looking for. And by the time, particularly Antioch is captured, the perception that Alexis is willing to take what the Crusaders recover without actually providing any force to help them has gotten so bad that relationship sort of falls apart. Various other Crusader forces do a better or worse job of coordinating and working with the Byzantine Empire. But there is support there, but there's also the Roman emperors, as they would still consider themselves, are very wary about who they allow to gain too much power in their backyard, so to speak. But yeah, one of the pieces that I don't I didn't spend a whole lot of time or intend to spend a whole lot of time getting into, but there's just an amazing cultural diffusion in this region of art and music and various styles that come together between the Christian and Islamic worlds, between Western Christians, the Byzantines, Armenians. There's just some absolutely beautiful synthesis. It's also one of the reasons why Templar, as a complete aside, but one of the reasons why Templar conspiracy theories work so well is because so much Templar iconography captures so many different elements of so many different cultures that it's easy to read into it what you want as secret messages, because they're capturing the world that they live in, which is an Islamic Christian mixed world, except for these there's a long period between the First Crusade and when Jerusalem falls, where there's certainly conflict around the edges, but within the Holy Land itself, there's relative peace in the interiors, where some amazing cultural interjunctions are taking place. But that could be a whole nother. This was kind of a hard one to prepare for because there's so many great paths that you can go down and talk about. All right, so how does Saladin sort of take control and get into a position to control the region in the way that he does? And you are correct that he was a Kurd, as best as we can determine. He starts as a relatively minor military commander, who is a fairly gifted military commander. And his uncle, who is one of the leading players in the region, sends him to Egypt to help provide aid, support, and military leadership in Egypt. He is able, some make the case that it was through treachery, whether it was through treachery, whether he was opportunistic, whether he was a very charismatic leader, whether it was a combination of all of them. What he is able to do essentially in moving from a military advisor is to essentially gain control in Egypt of the entire region, and become actually crowned as a Sultan of Egypt. And one of the things that allows him to do is tap into the massive wealth and manpower resources of Egypt. And although he is, certainly best known for his conflicts with Westerners, most of the fighting and conquest that Saladin does is actually with his neighbors. And he frequently uses the Western Crusaders sort of as a reason why the various Islamic states need to work together, which gives him a foot in the door, allowing him then to sort of bring them more fully under his control. And by doing so, unifies a region that was not, very fractured beforehand. So between 1169 and 1174, you have the capture of Damascus. You have when his uncle passes away, Saladin is able to declare himself as an independent ruler and take over. He is able to take control of Aleppo. There is a brief period of time between 1177 and 1179 when he focuses his energy on the Western Crusaders. This is where recently there's been by recently, I mean, last 5, maybe 10 years, the castle at Jacob's Ford has been discovered archaeologically. This was a border castle built by the Templars, and sort of supported by the Crusader states, particularly King Baldwin IV, that there had been stories about, had, basically reached, the story said had been completed, but then had been captured by Saladin and his forces. And this was long sort of in dispute. Well, they discovered the archaeological remnants, and there's been a couple different documentaries that have been put out that you can find on YouTube or wherever you want to look them up. And it is increasingly, the capture of this castle increasingly looks like it might be more important to the story of Saladin and the Third Crusade than it had been before. That this was really the first of the Crusader fortresses to fall. And it's quite a bit of time before the rest of the conflict is going to bring the rest of them down. But it's the start of that. And the fact that there's just some amazing, archaeological evidence, including the foundations of the walls. They've discovered probably not all of the graves, but some graves, to be able to identify battlefield trauma and things of that nature, which make for some interesting reading. And if you're into the sort of forensic archaeology side of historical battles, there's some neat reports out there, and documentaries on it. But there's a sense that, and this comes through in Islamic sources as well, that Saladin is mostly focused on pulling together the Islamic world. That's really his interest, is taking control of those various city-states. But that he gets increasing pressure to sort of follow through with what he's saying is the reason why he's been bringing everybody together, which is we need to be able to oppose the Western Crusaders, but you're not spending a lot of time actually opposing the Western Crusaders. And so that's where we see sort of these moments like here in the late 1170s, where there's a brief but very sharp focus on conflict with the West. That will then come back at later points after a bit more focus on sort of internal conflicts. That's going to lead, there we go, sort of to making those deeper inroads. And by 1185, he will have largely pulled together all of the areas bordering the Crusader states, not into a unified government, because that doesn't exist in the medieval world, and not sort of with one mind and one purpose, but moving together much more than previously. And it's going to do a couple things. It's going to provide a manpower resource that wasn't there before. There are very few military engagements for the rest of the Crusades where Crusaders are going to have the advantage of numbers. And it also allows for more sustained operations, because with everybody sort of moving together and a sort of understanding that this is what all these groups are doing at the same time, you have to watch your back less when you are in conflict. And one of the things that becomes more prominent is longer sieges and being willing to take your army and oppose an opponent and keep an army in the field for a while without worrying about what's going on behind you nearly as much as had been previous. That's a really quick sort of view of Saladin and pulling together the Islamic world. but are there sort of any questions or thoughts or before we sort of take a look at the fall of Jerusalem and moving from pulling together the Islamic world into creating the Third Crusade?
Andrew, it's me again. So from what I've read is Salahuddin was very hesitant in going and outside of his realm and facing Templars, so to speak. And he had been really approached by a Khalif, I don't know who was a Khalif at the time, and said, listen, it's your duty as a Muslim person to go out there and do this jihad, because we're really being under the siege here, and you are as a believer in our religion, you can't just bypass this. You got to help us out. And initially he was pretty, as you alluded, he went to Egypt, he kind of conquered, and then again, Mamluks. So were the Mamluks, right? They were Circassians from the mountains of Caucasus that were slaves. Yeah. And then turned into and then won the battle and became so to speak kings of or sultans of Egypt. So he probably had used the same kind of lateral. What I'm just trying to say is that initially that wasn't his idea to face Templars or be a leader. He was pushed into this basically.
Yes, and does a really good. So there's a fine line when we look at historic leaders too. Really good leaders throughout history are often really good too at putting themselves into positions to lead where they're gaining the support of others, whether they're seeking it or not, to help move them into prominence into that position. And there are some historians that make the case that that is one of the things that he was doing, that he was sort of putting himself forward as, well, I'm not sure that I really want to do, but if you insist that I'm the best one to the sort of that dynamic. How true that is, that's a tone that is really hard to read in historic sources. And I am personally very ill-equipped to read particularly Islamic sources from the 12th century.
Do you think, Andrew, that he was, in a way, it was his obligation to recapture Jerusalem? It was a rallying kind of point.
I don't think it's exclusive. I am very skeptical of monocausality in any historic event. I think that you can believe in your faith and you can believe in your calling and you believe that this is the right thing to do, and also see it as an expedient thing you need to do for your position and for what you are personally, your personal ambitions are hoping to accomplish. And it is very popular sometimes in history to sort of focus in on one of those elements. Like, oh, you can't really truly believe your job is to lead your people to recapture Jerusalem because you truly believe that in a religious sense. You're only doing it for your, to raise your own esteem in the world and gain more power. I'm willing to believe that it could partially be both, maybe not even intentionally. Good leaders are often ambitious and become good leaders because they are able to pull power together and use it successfully. You can both believe it's the right thing to do and also be taking advantage of it for your own gain, if that makes any sense.
Andrew.
Yes.
Ralph here. I'm curious about the ethnic and linguistic basis. Now, I guess the Seljuks were Turks, presumably speaking Turkish or a Turkic language. Saladin was Arab in origin, and I guess Egypt had been Arabized by this point, so Egypt was Arabic speaking. And was that an important division between the Arabs and the Turks?
That is an excellent question, and I don't have information one way or the other to make a definitive statement on it, other than saying that cultural differences, and I'm not sure how linguistic they were, but cultural differences between Kurds and Arabs and Egyptians and Armenians were very much a part of the story of the Levant in this period. That interplay of cultures is an absolutely huge element. Tracing that into where the language barrier. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Now Saladin rose to power in Egypt, but where did he come? Was he from Egypt?
No, he is.
Where did he come from?
I know that he is sort of sent as a military advisor from Damascus, under the sort of with his uncle. As far as where he grew up and his early history, that I don't know, and I'm honestly not sure that I have run across anything that has done a good job of delving into it. Whether that's because we don't have those sources or that's just not been a part of the story that's been told. But now I have something new that I want to look into and research.
By the way, he was Kurd.
Yes.
By origin, not Arab.
Yes.
So I imagine he would be from the area somewhere in Iraq.
Yes, I'm not sure when. I know ethnically he's Kurdish. I'm not sure if he grew up in Damascus. Again, that early life and where those connections are, that I'm not as certain on. But it is largely accepted that he was ethnically Kurdish, correct. There are some outliers that don't seem to want to believe that, but the vast basis of scholarship seems to be against that.
Yeah, but certainly Turks and Arabs didn't mix and didn't support each other as Muslims. You know.
And one of the reasons why Jerusalem was taken with the First Crusade is because it had recently been recaptured between, the conflict between Turks and Arabs in the region. And so there's some suggestion that it was both the case of sort of being militarily unprepared and worn out, as well as just not getting the news that there's this giant group of crazy homicidal Western Christians coming to reclaim it, which is, the First Crusade, by the time they reach Jerusalem, is extraordinarily fanatic. And it's a fascinating, study in how that fervor can influence decisions. And essentially, by the time the final approach to Jerusalem is begun, the First Crusade is essentially the Crusaders leading the leaders. The leaders kind of balked at continuing forward, and everybody else just started heading toward Jerusalem. And the leaders were like, "Oh, we'll come too."
Andrew, it just came to my mind about the Jerusalem. So it was taken by Saladin, but and of course Third Crusade, it stayed in Saladin's hands. But if I recall correctly, just quickly, like to recap, later on at some point, I think it's like in 1230, it was retaken by Christians, and then right, and then it was taken by Turks.
Yes,
From Christians. That's the idea, right?
And yes, and there's a, and we'll see it even at the end of the Third Crusade. It is frequently offered up as a sort of bargaining chip in negotiations, and some move closer and some move further from being accepted. But yes, there is a brief period of time where it switches back. Excuse me. And off the top of my head, I don't have the chain of events to hand of sort of that path. But you're absolutely right. there's a couple of moments where there's swings back and forth.
All right, let's.
In many ways, this is one of the most unified either side will be during this time period is through the midst of the Third Crusade. Neither side are wholly unified at the same time, though, which is why you see a little bit of swinging back and forth in the power struggle. All right. So if you're familiar at all with the movie Kingdom of Heaven, I always have to, one of my good friends absolutely loathes the movie Kingdom of Heaven because he wanted it. Yes.
I love it.
No, he loathes it. He cannot stand it.
He loathes it. I am the other way around.
Absolutely hates it because
Yeah, I'm a fan.
he's a huge, he is hugely focused on the history.
Okay.
And the paths it takes away from the history drive him absolutely crazy. I think it's absolutely gorgeous. And given how bad medieval movies tend to be, anything that is gorgeous and fun to watch, I am totally for. But one of but there's a definite agenda to the storytelling in Kingdom of Heaven. And the agenda is very much that Renaud of Châtillon and Guy of Lusignan are terrible homicidal maniacs who are causing havoc because that is what they do, to the point of being literally quoted in the movie, "Start me a war, that's what I do." When their real characters were probably a lot more nuanced, as is often the case. Conflict was brewing long before Jerusalem fell. And it wasn't brewing simply because the leaders in Jerusalem were trying to cause conflict or raiding caravans without necessarily recourse to do so. With the fall of Jacob's Ford and the conflicts earlier, there had been some definite strides forward by Islamic forces. So there's much more sort of nuanced interplay between the two sides along the border regions. And it's going to build up. A secession crisis is going to become part of it. King Baldwin IV, the Leper King, is going to die. It is not going to be Guy of Lusignan through his wife, Baldwin's sister, who immediately takes over. The throne is going to pass to Baldwin's nephew. That does not go well or long. Eventually, Guy of Lusignan is going to be crowned king of Jerusalem because he's simply the strongest and most effective military leader that is available to pull all these elements together, that has a connection to the kingship of Jerusalem. And he is going to lead his forces forward into what could be described as an absolutely masterful defeat at the hands of Saladin. The battle at Hattin is almost sort of a perfect playbook for how you force your enemy into doing exactly what you want them to do. And I don't necessarily think that's because Guy was an idiot or was, as depicted in the movie, so arrogant that he refused to accept that an army needs water. We often like to look at whose fault a loss was instead of just simply admiring the brilliance that led to the success. And I think that is very much the case in the fighting at the Horns of Hattin. Saladin absolutely played his enemy into doing exactly what he wanted them to do. And it was an overwhelming masterstroke in that regard. So a little bit about medieval warfare. We talked a little earlier about the sort of hesitation maybe to come to battle. That's pretty common of medieval rulers, because battles are a really, really good way of losing and losing everything. If you lose a battle in the Middle Ages, you have the opportunity to lose everything, particularly, I mean, certainly if you are killed, you've lost your life. But if a king is killed, then the kingdom has lost the entire government that makes that kingdom function in many respects, which is vested in the hands of its king. In addition to that, even if you're not personally injured, if you lose your army in the field, it's very hard to remobilize a new force and have reserves to be able to continue a conflict. If there is a large-scale battles are rare in the medieval period. When they happen, if one side loses it conclusively, then it is often incredibly dramatic in the impacts it has. The Battle of Hastings, you have the Norman conquest of England. It is probably too much to say that, you know, that one battle completely loses England, but there are, further battles after that, but it is essentially a long-term mopping up, operation after that. If you look at, it's going to be the case here at Hattin with the destruction of most of the army of Jerusalem. It is a case at the Battle of Bouvines, which between Philip and conglomerate of forces that helps lead to the loss of Normandy for John and the kings of England. When they happen, medieval field battles, if the armies actually engage, and if it is a decisive battle, has a massive effect. And good military commanders in the medieval period know this. And so they are often very hesitant to engage unless they truly believe that they have the advantage to be successful. Both Richard and Saladin are going to, certainly do that. And Saladin does it here. So what, leads to this, this massive success? The Army of Jerusalem is essentially moving to lift a siege. This is really the backdrop of medieval warfare, siege warfare, and what happens, and you routinely see in most medieval campaigns is it turns into essentially a chess match attempting to capture your opponent's castles, and that's going to be the case here. The town of Tiberias is going to be placed under siege by Saladin's forces. You can't just let your opponent have all the time in the world in order to take one of your castles or one of your settlements. So the army, the army of the King of Jerusalem is going to march out to try to relieve the siege. And there are only so many ways an army can travel, particularly in areas where there isn't a lot of water. And what Saladin does is simply baits the Western Crusader army to move deeper and deeper into contact while making the lack of water on their march route more and more acute of a problem. They light brush fires which both disorients as well as increase the issues of thirst of the Crusader armies until essentially the Crusader army just runs out of energy and is forced to stop and set up camp because of exhaustion, dehydration, and that they've just been pulled into this area where they don't have the resources to keep moving forward. And at that moment, Saladin is able to surround and attack from multiple angles, and essentially destroy the vast majority of trained warriors in the Kingdom of Jerusalem in one battle. Once again, he has the advantage of numbers, but there are also numbers that are very, very well employed. As far as the after effect of in many ways, the siege of Jerusalem is postscript to the Horns of Hattin. Had Hattin happened in any other way, and that army not been destroyed, then the siege probably would not even have been attempted. Saladin was able to besiege Jerusalem because he knew that there just simply would not be a Christian army in the field able to oppose him in any meaningful fashion. As far as the after effects, the Christian armies in Jerusalem had traditionally used as one of their standards the True Cross, as they had called it, which, as best as modern scholarship can determine, was supposedly a fragment of the True Cross that was in a large golden cross, rather than it being thought to be the entire cross, but was certainly held to be the actual cross upon which Christ had been crucified. It is captured. The Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller that are captured in the action are summarily executed as not being sort of fit for ransom. There are quite a few knights or individuals who are able to ransom themselves, but the King of Jerusalem, Guy of Lusignan, is captured and held prisoner. He will be released later, but certainly not in any time to try to gather a follow-on army. Unlike in Kingdom of Heaven, Balian of Ibelin is captured. He fights at the Battle of Hattin and is captured. He is released on parole, which he immediately breaks and goes to Jerusalem. And essentially, that's not true, and that's not fair to him. He was under parole and stopped in Jerusalem on his way in terms of leaving the Holy Land, and was begged by the leaders of the city to take command, and he did so. He's still breaking his parole, but it's not quite the same heroic story as portrayed in the movie. But in terms of the after effect, Renaud de Chatillon is executed as the movie portrays. But after Hattin, there is no such thing as a professional army able to take the field around Jerusalem, at least not immediately. And it'll take time to rebuild that force. And so it really is going to lead to the next steps. And that's going to be the siege and fall of Jerusalem in 1187. Balian of Ibelin does take control of the city. He does negotiate with Saladin to essentially allow anyone who wishes to leave the city in return for a peaceful transfer. There is this story that quite a few individuals were knighted on the spot to take over, military roles within the city as part of the defense. So there are some nice elements of the movie that seem to have happened. But Jerusalem, there is a siege. It is not particularly long nor protracted, simply because it is very much a case of trading lives for the property. There's simply no way that Jerusalem is going to be able to hold out against the force that opposes them after Hattin. And that is very clear to Balian and the leaders in Jerusalem. And so the sort of the peace is made, the deal is made, and the Christian forces evacuate. All right, so we're going to shift here from the Holy Land to Western Europe and take a look at Richard. But are there any questions or comments or thoughts or?
Oh, we're ready for Richard.
All right, let's talk about Richard then. You can't talk about Richard I without at least mentioning his family. He is the result of the power couple of Middle Ages Europe, particularly in the 12th century. His father, Henry II of England, arguably created the richest, most efficient, and most powerful government in Europe at the time. He will control essentially from England south to the Pyrenees Mountains. Most of the western part of France is under the control of the Angevin Empire with Henry at its head. He was an incredibly dynamic leader and ruler in his own right, certainly matched in ability, temperament, and story by his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Henry II was not Eleanor's first husband. She had actually been on crusade with her first husband, Louis of France, as part of the Second Crusade, which was not particularly successful. She got into some political turmoil there over her uncle and their possible relationship, which may have just been salacious conversation at the time, but it certainly didn't help matters between her and her husband any. And their marriage quickly dissolved with no children, and she turned around and married Henry II. Richard is going to spend a lot of his youth in conflicts with his brothers and with his father. Henry's oldest son, also Henry, often known as Henry the Young King, because Henry II follows through with what had been the practice in some countries such as France, but not necessarily England up to that point. He'll actually king his eldest son, so the line of succession is secure and very clear to everybody. The result of that is going to be that his eldest son, Henry, who becomes known as Henry the Young King, because he is a king, expects to be treated like a king. Henry II doesn't like to give up the power that he has spent most of his life consolidating. And so he and his son are going to end up into several bouts of conflict. Richard is going to be on Henry's side for the first one and on his father's side for the second one. In the second one, Henry the Young King is going to die of dysentery, which is going to make Richard the de facto next in line. And so now that Richard is the presumed heir to the throne, what happens? Well, he and his father get into conflict over power and control. And so Richard and Henry are in open warfare. Richard was a much better general than his elder brother had been, much better general than his younger brothers were. And so what's going to end up happening? I mean, Henry is essentially going to lose, but by the time this conflict is wrapping up, Henry II is essentially dying. And so it is, going to be a relatively quick transition from Henry II to Richard I in 1189. supposedly when the Henry II leans down to give the kiss of peace on sealing up this particular rebellion with his son, he's going to lean over and say into his son's ear, "May I not die before I've seen my vengeance on you," which will not happen. But that might give you an idea of the sort of family relationships in Henry's family, where everybody seems to be fighting with everyone else all the time. It's going to be in sort of the middle of this second, revolution that it's actually right before it that in 1187 the news of the fall of Jerusalem arrives. The Pope calls for a new crusade to retake Jerusalem. Brand new Pope, because the last one, when he heard that Jerusalem had fallen, died of a heart attack. So Richard is actually going to take his crusader vows before he's even crowned as king. Once he has been crowned king, though, and sort of a back step, it was particularly between the Second and the Third Crusades, it was really common for high-ranking lords in Europe to take crusading vows but never actually get around to going on crusade, always with the best of intentions, of course. But it was kind of expected that at least somebody in your family was going to take crusading vows, but there were often political or military reasons why you couldn't leave quite yet. The church made a lot of, or at least claimed that there would be a lot of protections on crusaders' property and kingdom. But the amount of power that the church actually had to defend that property was, or at least that was they were willing to use to do it, was not necessarily the case. Richard is a good example. As we'll see, it's going to be threats at home that cause him to leave the Third Crusade perhaps early. Clearly, he did not think that the church was going to keep Philip of France from invading his lands. So he is crowned in 1189, and it is going to essentially be 2 years, close to 2 years before he is actually going to set sail. The Third Crusade is the first crusade that has actual monarchs in position of leadership. So you have Philip of France, you have Richard of England, and you have Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire. And the three of them are sort of appointed in joint command of the Third Crusade. It is about the only way that you could have gotten Richard or Philip to go on crusade was if the other one went along, because both of them knew that if I leave home and my opponent is still there, I'm going to lose some of, if not all of my kingdom. And there's a lot of reasons for the antipathy. The very fact that both of them are carrying on the dispute of their fathers. Supposedly, Richard was to marry Philip's sister, who some had claimed had become Henry II's mistress before he died. Philip at various points would demand that Alice, be brought out from wherever she was being kept, and that the marriage actually be carried through. Richard's going to finally sort of close the door on that right before he arrives in the Holy Land, which is not going to make relations with him and Philip any better. Richard is going to go to huge economic lengths to support the as much as possible the logistics that he's going to need for the crusade. He's supposedly to have said that he would sell London if he could find a buyer to help support the crusade. But he is finally ready to depart in 1190. And unlike Frederick Barbarossa with his forces who are going to go overland. Both Richard and Philip are going to go by sea. Sort of a natural decision for the English monarch, maybe not as much of one necessarily for the French monarch, but they're going to use naval power. And it's going to be one of Richard's sort of hallmarks throughout this campaign. He uses, he's very canny about how he uses ships and transport by sea. Of course, before we have railroads, the easiest way to transport any kind of material is by water. It has its own risks, certainly. That is certainly true in the case of the Third Crusade. There are a lot of losses in shipwrecks, but it allows you to transport heavy materials far more efficiently than any other method, particularly when you don't have to cross Asia Minor to actually get the Crusader armies that come by way of Constantinople have travails and conflicts before they ever reach the Holy Land. That's going to be what happens to Frederick Barbarossa's forces. They are going to cross over the Dardanelles into Asia Minor. Frederick Barbarossa is going to be drowned when his horse throws him in a river crossing. His army is going to suffer sickness, and eventually only a very small number of those forces from the Holy Roman Empire are going to make it into the Holy Land to support the Third Crusade. Richard and Philip do a much better job of getting their forces there. Richard makes a couple stops along the way, Messina in Sicily and Cyprus, to conquer both of those. Through their Norman connections, there was actually a lot of attempts to for what were then the English royal family to either have control of or take control in Sicily. It had been briefly offered as a possible kingdom to rule for John, Richard's younger brother. Nothing much came of that. It would become an increasing issue in John's son's reign, in the Edward's reign, in Henry III's reign, and then later his grandson Edward I's reign, the idea of this connection to Sicily. But there's some attempts with Messina. Richard stops along the way to conquer it. Cyprus is going to be much more useful as a base of operations. And it's going to be at Cyprus in 1191 that Richard I is going to marry. Marriages for medieval rulers are political in addition to anything else they might be.
Andrew, excuse me.
Yes.
Cyprus still a Byzantine territory at this time? Why it's certainly not the Islamic, right?
I think it had been conquered, but now you have me on who it had been conquered by. I know Richard uses it essentially as a naval base for bringing supplies into Acre. But I would have to double check on who had been in control. Sicily. In Sicily, there's still conflict with Islamic forces, and Christian as well. Essentially, in Sicily, everyone's fighting everyone. But I'm not sure now off the top of my head for Cyprus.
Was it Commodus? The Emperor Commodus, by chance? No.
I don't believe it.
Nah, probably not.
I want to say that Richard and Richard's relationship with the Byzantine Empire are pretty good, but you may have me on that one. I'll have to look that up. I'll get back to everybody.
Asking another question, if I
Yes,
may.
please.
I often wonder, is it really relevant who is the king of England to the people in England? Because we have here a situation where, again, king is leaving England, and the king doesn't even speak the same language as the common people in England. Does it really matter to the common people who the king is in England with Richard?
I would say yes, and the reason that I would say yes is because the life, I mean, at some level, the medieval world is trickle down economics at their worst, but the life of the common person in any medieval kingdom is going to be vastly influenced by the method and control of resources, taxes, and sort of the safety net that is in place within the region. And what I mean by that is, if your lords are able to do their jobs in managing their estates without worrying about constant conflict, then the management of those estates is going to be better, and the lifestyle for the average person working on those estates is going to be better than at other periods. During Henry's reign, it was really, really good to be an average Englishman. Your king did not speak English. The lord of your manor might not speak English. They're starting to, but they might not. But there was not conflict to any large degree in England. The only real concerns of conflict in England were caused by Henry's own family. And because lords could worry less about conflict and military provisioning and organization, and more on just increasing their own wealth, the average life for an English peasant at the time was remarkably good. And one of the reasons we know this is because it gets so bad during John's reign, and because there's such efforts made to sort of claw it back, particularly during, things don't get much better in John's son's reign. But Edward I starts to sort of rebuild that. And England has largely a pretty good, with the exception of moments like John's reign, with the exception of some periods of conflict with the Welsh and the Scots in Edward I's reign. Most English kings, at least up until this point, try to keep a buffer zone around England itself. There's a lot made of Henry not being a good English king because he didn't spend a lot of time in England. Well, John spent a whole lot of time in England because he lost everything else and has a rebellion within his own country. So Richard's able, in the periods in which Richard is King of England and in Europe, he spends a lot of time fighting conflicts in France that completely shield England from any of those disruptions. Richard also did a really, really good job of picking reasons to be away that were generally popular with everyone else. The idea of your king going on crusade was a pretty popular thing in a society as tied into their Christianity as medieval Europe, that believes in the concept of a crusade as laid down by the papacy. That idea of seeking redemption and resolution through securing the Jerusalem for Christianity was not only would give an individual spiritual benefits, but if your kingdom is a direct reflection of your king, and your king was doing that task for spiritual benefits, then that couldn't help but be good for your kingdom as well, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, it does make sense. But I mean, because there's another 200 years, I think, before a king of England spoke English. Because it was
I would
14 something. I can't remember what. First king of England, Henry.
I'm pretty certain that John probably could speak English. Not that he did, but that he could. You're correct in that it's going to take that long before English becomes the language of the nobility.
Right.
One of the, and this is a complete aside, the concept of particularly of literacy to medieval nobility, when we talk about, well, most medieval nobles were illiterate. Illiteracy, as they would have defined it, would have been defined by the people that had it, which were the clergy, and which referred to largely reading and writing in Latin.
Yeah.
There's a really good bed of scholarship that suggests there were a whole lot more people who could read and write in the vernacular that were not considered literate because they could not read or write necessarily in Latin. So I think John was far better educated in what we would think of academic pursuits. Richard's education is war because he is given control of the Aquitaine and has to hold it in a very unsettled region, even in his youth. That's his job in the family before he's going to become king. Before it's known that he's going to be next in line for king. And so he's sort of schooled in warfare from a very early age, whereas John is schooled in academics. And I would put solid money that John could, because and Richard too. Richard was known for being very deep, have a very deep understanding of Latin and make jokes in Latin to the sort of the detriment of clerks and scribes and priests around him.
Wrote poetry, right?
Yeah. Oh yes,
Wrote poetry.
Well, his mother grew up in, Richard was very much Eleanor of Aquitaine's favorite of the children. She is responsible for well, she's not responsible, but she grows up in the rise of the troubadours. It's her uncle that is like the first troubadour in France. And so the ideas of like courtly love and poetry and the arts were just growing in her youth, and it's very clear that she sort of passed them down to Richard. He composed songs, he composed poetry, made jokes in Latin. He didn't have necessarily the book learning that John would have had. John essentially had a monastic education, but Richard was certainly no lightweight in terms of understanding, sort of great artistic bent of pursuits.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, and the language thing is interesting though, because they didn't speak English for another 300 years, and to this day, I mean, in our modern English, all the animals when they're alive, like
yes,
like pig. Well, when they're alive, like pigs and that sort of thing. It's cows, etc. But when they're dead, they're veal and chickens and poultry, rather. Yeah,
the poor person raises them and the rich person eats them. Yep,
exactly. I mean,
poetry was done mostly in Occitan language at that time. The language in Aquitaine, the language of troubadours.
Yeah.
Thanks for that.
Oh, absolutely. My favorite description of English is that it is less of a language and more of a hostage situation, which about describes how English works, because it is so many different forms muddled together by succeeding waves of invasion. But that is very much the world in which Richard grew up, and he very much sort of tapped into those elements.
Andrew,
Yes.
I looked it up about the Cyprus.
Oh,
Yeah,
excellent.
it was actually a part of the Byzantine Empire, was ruled by Isaac Comnene, who was not his brother succeeded to the throne of Byzantine Empire, but he was given Cyprus. But the thing is that while the Richard sailed from Sicily, there was a storm, and the ships went different ways. And one of the ships that carried his sister Joanne and his fiancée Berengaria landed in Cyprus. And Isaac, the ruler Isaac Comnene, took them captive. And that was the reason why Richard attacked them and took over, because he was insulted and he was unwilling to give them back. That's the story. Interesting.
Thank you so much. Any other questions on Richard or?
No questions.
But I remember, by the way, the story how he took Cyprus, just by memory. It was really amazing, showed his leadership. He basically started the attack alone. He just went ahead without even looking, and his army, just as they landed, they just followed him, and he just took the fort right away without much of a resistance. It was so unexpected. So it's kind of showed his leadership.
There are similar stories when he lands at Acre, that he essentially charges off of the boat straight into combat. Probably less true at Acre because it's in a pretty solid siege situation by that point, but it's possible.
There was this an interesting fact about him, right? They said the reason soldiers respected him is because he wouldn't dare his soldiers to do anything he wouldn't do himself. So that's why, it was a big difference between him and the others.
And there's sort of reoccurring stories of him going into combat less fully armored than one would expect, of him in the conflicts with his father, in a pursuit situation where he's essentially unarmored on horseback, and engages in combat with William Marshall. That story is often connected to his death at the siege of Châlus, where he's hit by a crossbow bolt, and there's claims that he wasn't wearing armor around his neck, which is why the wound occurred. The truth of those, or whether it's just it makes for daring telling, is certainly hard to pin down. But there is sort of this reoccurring idea that he not only was willing to certainly lead from the front, but was very willing to sort of risk his life if necessary in those situations, and go in under armored.
I looked a bit at some ship transport issues around the time of the Crusades a while ago. And of course, horse transports were a special type of ship. They had troop transports, horse transports. Yeah, and the horse transports, at least some of them, were designed so the knights could get on their armor, get their weapons, get on their horses, and ride off the ships. The ships were like the landing craft of D-Day. They would lower down a gangplank, and the riders would ride off ready for battle, I guess in part because the landing, of course, like at D-Day, the landing is the most vulnerable time for an invasion.
Yeah, there's been some studies done, particularly with based around Hastings and the depiction of ships in the Bayeux Tapestry with horses. And one of the things that they discovered is that now I would not want to be in essentially the boats that are reflected there are very similar to what we think of as Viking airboats. I mean, it's the same culturally. Normans and English are, everybody's tying from the same technology tree there. But essentially those they found, if you beached them, they had a low enough freeboard that a horse could leap from the boat onto the shore. Now, clearly that's not what you're going to carry horses across the Mediterranean in, not if you want any of your horses to survive. Horse transport, even through the Crimean War, is always a problem and always a challenge. And there are lots of horses that don't make it.
Yeah, just to
Particularly
comment
if you,
on that, that's right. You can't have horses standing up on a sea voyage. So they were, they had little stalls, but they were in slings. So they were sort of supported.
to support
They
the
were
weight.
constrained and supported with their weight off the ground, more or less off the ground for the entire trip.
That being said, you could not pay me enough to take a long sea voyage with a bunch of stallions in small stalls with slings under them for long periods of time. I can't even imagine especially the sheer strength that you would get with, and that's a medieval war horse as a stallion. So a lot of temperament
That's right.
to deal
Well,
with.
yeah, they were pretty well confined, and I guess the soldiers did not sail on the horse transport. There were troop transports and there were separate horse transports. So yeah, the soldiers would not sail with I suppose maybe they had to go on to the horse transports in order to land, but generally the horse transports were horse transports, as I understand it. Thanks.
And so much of the transport that Richard and Philip are going to use is not purpose built. It is simply hired. Particularly southern Italy does a lot of good trade throughout the Crusades in transport of troops over to the Holy Land. Particularly Pisa comes up quite a bit in terms of shipments coming over.
Let me just suggest.
Well, I know for.
I think you guys are thinking of this modern day. They're not making opposed landings. More often than not, they're landing on an empty shore. They get on their horses and then they go to war. When it's a siege situation, that's a bit different. But the thing is, those horses aren't traveling a great distance. So if you're able to get off the ship with your horse, you haven't traveled very far.
Right. Particularly as we're and where that sea chain is really useful is when you have some place for them to go. And that's why the city of Acre is going to become so important, because it is such a significant port. And it's the reason why it's sort of selected as the starting point for the reconquest of Jerusalem.
Yeah, I guess I don't know about the Third Crusade, but I know for the Fourth Crusade, of course, I guess the Venetians were commissioned to build the fleet to sail. So those ships for the Fourth Crusade, the ships were custom built for the Crusades by commission of the Crusaders. There was a big problem with paying for it, and that's a whole nother story, but they were custom built for the Crusades to sail from Venice, well, to the Holy Land via ending up via other routes.
And there's also a lot of commissioning of existing shipping for that purpose. All right. So that's a really excellent transition into Acre. Acre is arguably one of the most iconic sieges of the Middle Ages. It is one of the unique situations of a city besieged and having the besiegers in turn become besieged themselves. So Acre is captured shortly after Jerusalem falls. And it is none other than Guy of Lusignan, who the king of Jerusalem, who begins the attempt to recapture it. He's going to It is going to be in September of 1189 that the sort of first wave of Crusaders are going to arrive to join Guy of Lusignan in bottling up Acre. It is going to take some time for Saladin to respond to this, particularly because he has to pull his forces back together. There are some internal dynamics. During the siege of Acre, his nephew is actually going to take a portion of the army and march off to deal with internal issues and internal pursuits. And it is it's going to take time for the elements of the Third Crusade coming in to sort of add to the Crusader force as part of the siege. And the first element that's actually going to reach them is going to be the leftover contingent from the Holy Roman Empire. They are now going to be under Duke Leopold of Austria, who's going to take control. He's going to become important to the Richard story later on. And then it is going to be in June of 1191 before Philip and Richard arrive. When Philip and Richard finally arrive, you have two monarchs that have reached the siege, and they bring with them resources. And what this allows them to do is, for the first time, to employ heavy siege machines. The Trebuchet has just recently come onto the scene. There were at least two of them that were employed at Acre. One of them with the name of Bad Neighbor. I suppose if your neighbor had a giant piece of artillery aimed at your door, that probably would qualify them in that regard. Richard is able to build a large-scale siege tower. One of the advantages that siege towers give, which is not usually, movies depict siege towers particularly poorly because they are these giant lumbering things that slowly roll up and are usually collapsed by some method of cunning of the troops inside the castle or town in film. The real advantage of a siege tower is that you can put your archers on top of it, and they are now higher than the troops on the battlement. And it gives you the opportunity to try to clear some of your opponents from the walls. But one of the things that proves to be effective at Acre, and is arguably the most effective technique in fighting any type of castle in the Middle Ages, it's what defeats the castle at Jacob's Ford. It's what defeats Rochester Castle in the First Barons' War in England, is undermining. If you can get enough material from under a wall or under the corner of a tower or under a keep and collapse it, you can create an opening that will allow you to come through. Richard manages to do this at Acre. It's not immediately successful, but it's part of the weakening of the garrison. And the way that he's able to do it is by offering soldiers 2 gold coins for every stone they pull from the wall. Later, he ups it to 3 gold coins. And so that offer of a quick cash payout helps cause the collapse of at least one of the towers outside Acre during the siege. And eventually, I mean, it's gone on for years.
If I could comment on that. Yeah, I think when people talk about siege engines, most people think of the catapult or trebuchet or something. But in fact, I looked a while and I couldn't find a single example of a castle or walled city that was defeated by knocking down the walls of by a catapult. Apparently it just never happened. A catapult could throw things over the walls and into the city and do some damage. But as you say, it was mining and siege towers. And I guess siege towers were a much more effective siege weapon or siege machine than the catapults were. The catapults people love catapults, but they weren't terribly effective weapons. Thanks.
They're beginning. You're starting to see with trebuchets are a whole nother ball game because the counterweight and the sling allows you to hurl larger missiles than ever before. But until you hit the point of gunpowder, the idea of battering down the wall through mechanical means is really quite difficult. Gunpowder, of course, is an absolute game changer as far as.
But
as
that
battering
wasn't
down
until
the
the
wall.
1400s.
Right, and that's where you see, with the Siege of Orleans and Joan of Arc, and you start to see gunpowder becoming the dominating factor in siege warfare. But to a large, I mean, in a larger case, you're right. They certainly keep people's heads down. There are. The battering rams certainly come into play and are used. The effectiveness of battering rams is starting to fail a little bit at this point. This tower design, particularly in Western Europe, becomes more effective, and gatehouses become more effective. The easiest ways to capture a city are surprise, treachery, starvation, followed by undermining. And all of those are used by medieval leaders. It's going to be starvation and exhaustion more than the weapons, particularly, that is going to cause Acre to fall. Acre doesn't fall to direct assault necessarily. It is the gradual wearing down of the city, particularly as fresh resources come in with Philip and
I think that's right,
Richard.
and I think that was pretty typical in Europe as well.
Oh yes,
Yeah, besiege and depriving a city of water, food, and water, and that usually took about 6 months to a year. Thanks.
yeah, and one of the problems with Acre is you've got both a land side and a water side that need to be sealed off. And one of the reasons the siege of Acre takes so long is that simply the Crusaders don't have the resources to seal off both at the same time until Philip and Richard arrive with their contingents. There's just not enough naval power to close off the seaside at the same time as enough land power to close off the land side. When for a sort of extended period of time, Guy of Lusignan's siege lines are essentially double-sided because he has Acre on the inside and Saladin on the outside. And there's at least one, at one point, Saladin is able to launch a sortie that penetrates the Crusader lines long enough to get more troops and a new commander into Acre to continue the siege. There's some evidence that the commander who had been in command was wavering a little bit at that point, and sort of a fresh influx of troop supplies and leadership enabled it to keep going. And that's closed off when Philip and Richard arrive.
Can I ask one question? Is when you have all these sieges, if some people want to actually voluntarily leave, can they?
It depends. I mean, that sounds like an evasive answer, but the short answer is yes, particularly now, if you are a common foot soldier, you might have a very vastly different kind of arrangement depending on how you fit into the army. If you are a levy from your lord and your lord is not okay with you leaving, there can be drastic consequences. And if you are a simple foot soldier, you probably don't have the resources to get home anyway. However, if you're a lord and you decide you've had it and you're just going to walk off, there's, particularly in Crusader forces, there's not as much to hold you there. If you were a vassal of the King of England fighting in England under the eyes of the king, and you just walk away from a siege, there is going to be political repercussions in your life later. If you are part of a multinational is not really the right term, but a vastly varied Crusader force at the siege of Acre with two different monarchs kind of in control, but not directly in control, and you walk away from the siege, the biggest risk that you're going to run is what people are going to think of you if you've left the siege before accomplishing something. That happened to some crusaders who left. There were some that left during the First Crusade without reaching any kind of success, and they were ridiculed for having left and not fulfilled their vows. Philip is going to leave after Acre falls. We're done. Good. This is great. Jerusalem didn't fall, but hey, we got Acre back. That's enough for me. I'm going home. And I don't think I've ever come across any primary source where anyone thought less of Philip for having left after Acre had fallen. Now his father did receive the failure of the Second Crusade. I think there was some repercussions there, but partially, I mean, the Second Crusade was over before it started. And so it may just be because it was so unsuccessful. And Louis was always kind of a second fiddle to Henry II and never quite, you know, his marriage with Eleanor of Aquitaine fails. He is never really successful politically or military with Henry, and he's not successful in Crusade either. And so I think there was just a combination of things working against him there. But there wasn't generally like the idea of desertion or, you're serving in a military force. That's at least for Western armies at the time, that's not how the system works. There may be repercussions with your lord, depending on that connection. I know that the rules for being called out as a feudal levy in England were more specific. For example, there was one individual who's called up for service in Edward I's Scottish Wars, and he apparently arrived at the army, ate a cut of pork, fired all the arrows he had in the direction of the Scots, and then went home because that completed his service. I don't know what the agreement for his service was, but he found a loophole to get him out of it. So those are the sort of the best period examples I can give of those sort of criteria.
Hopefully a quick question. So what did Richard think when Philip went home, since part of the reason Richard went there was because Philip was going too?
Richard knows he has a problem and the clock is ticking. It's going to be the issue of that ticking clock is going to be dramatically made worse by the fact that he's going to get captured on his way home. Spoiler alert. But yes, in essence, at that point, it's going to call Richard's hand in some of his decisions.
Thank you.
So and that's the direction we're headed. So when Acre falls, arguably the most notorious incident, shall we say, in Richard's kingship occurs, and that is the massacre of the hostages taken at the fall of Acre. Somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 prisoners are beheaded by Richard I and his army. Backstep, because there are a couple pieces to throw in there first. When Acre falls, Duke Leopold of Austria is one of the first to get his troops to the walls. And he does the established pattern of claiming conquest in medieval Europe and has his banner hung from the walls as a sign that he has captured this. The banner is thrown down. Usually it is explained that Richard orders Leopold's banner sort of tossed down because there were already sort of pre-existing agreements and understandings of how the rights of conquest were to be claimed for Acre. And as a king, he supplants a duke, so Duke Leopold has no right to hang his banner when Richard is the leading monarch in the field at this point. It is also possible simply that it was the banner was thrown down by Richard's men without his direct knowledge. I don't think Richard necessarily would have cared had he known. That's going to have repercussions because Leopold is humiliated to a degree by the actions, and Leopold's going to remember that and sort of have a chip on his shoulder against Richard, which will come to play when Richard tries to go home. And at about the same time, Philip is going to decide, I've done my job, and he's going to go home. Some of the French contingent is going to go with him. Some is going to stay with Richard. Richard is able to pull together the Crusader forces that remain very effectively. So there's no great dispute of command after Philip leaves. But as part of the surrender of Acre agreements, Richard enters a period of negotiations with Saladin over what the fate of those hostages is going to be. There's different numbers that are put about, but the idea is that the lives of the hostages will be spared for gold. The one figure that's sometimes given is 200,000 pieces of gold. The release of several thousand Christian prisoners, many of whom from the Horns of Hattin, and the return of the relic of the True Cross. The way that the negotiations plays out changes wildly depending on whose accounts you read and what they're trying to say about Saladin and about Richard. There's certainly the claim out there that Richard is really not interested in hostages or negotiations. And so when the brief amount of time is up, he has them executed. The case can be certainly made that it was in Saladin's best interest to play for time, because there are always going to be more reserves for Islamic armies than for Western armies. So the longer time that Saladin can give himself to rebuild forces to oppose Richard, the more likely he's going to be successful. So it may simply be that Saladin knew that and Richard knew that, and so they were playing a kingly game of chicken with several thousands of people's lives at stake. But in the end, the negotiations do break down, and Richard follows through with the consequences of it, and that is by slaughtering the hostages. And it usually breaks down, and most descriptions of it either say Richard just didn't have time for hostages and so had them killed out of hand, or that he really was calling Saladin's bluff, and that Saladin had no intention whatsoever of providing what had been agreed upon. We can't get into their heads to understand that. I think
can I add something, Andrew?
Yes.
Sorry.
Please
this
do.
is my opinion, because I studied this, so I reviewed this a few times. For one, I mean, to house 3,000 prisoners with food and water and all that, that would have been a burden for Richard, right? And if he doesn't do it properly, it's going to only cause disease and more destruction. So I think, in my opinion, he did not want to have those 3,000 prisoners. So he definitely would want them ransomed off. And then two, Saladin, I think he was buying time, absolutely. And so a lot of historians will say, yeah, Richard slaughtered 3,000 innocent people, Muslims, but at the same time, I think Saladin watched. He could have done something. He could have kept his word and, you know, follow through with the ransom. So it's kind of like, you know, it's a tough call. But I don't think Richard had a mindset to kill them right from the start. In fact, I heard that he even extended the deadline. Let's just say the deadline was 30 days. He gave him more time.
There was a couple back and forths, and a little
Yeah.
bit of the gold was put forward. And I tend to, so thinking of these as complex, very resourceful, insightful leaders, the idea of them doing, you know, calling each other's bluffs and trying to get the most as they can out of this negotiation, that rings honestly to me, at least. I mean, I don't have the facts to say that for sure, but I think it is in both of their nature to, oh, I'm going to play for time. I can tell you're playing for time, so I'm going to call your bluff.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
So yeah, I tend to agree with you on that one. I don't. It is often painted as sort of a cold-blooded slaughter of a different ethnic and religious group.
Right. Yeah, it's not what you think of. When you think of Richard I or the Lionheart, you don't think of, oh, the man who killed 3,000, well, they will call them Saracens at the time, or Muslims. You don't think about that, but that did happen, you know? It's kind of like buried under the rug in some ways.
And I mean, we look at major wars of the 20th century and strategic bombing campaigns, unconditional surrender, or, you know, firebombing of cities. Things have not changed that much in terms of warfare and the threats we make against communities for our war aims. And so I think it's really, I'm always uncomfortable with cherry picking one reason for why something like that happens, because there's a deep chain of decision making. And yes, it is a whole lot easier to do when your opponent is a different race or creed or culture than yours. At the siege of Chateau Galliard in when Philip is fighting with John to reclaim Normandy, the citizens who have come into Chateau Galliard in Normandy for protection against the oncoming French force are eventually cast out by the defenders because there's just not enough food for everybody. And so Philip refuses his troops to allow them to enter his lines. And so essentially for much of the siege, there's 1,000 plus civilians between the two siege lines starving to death in the winter while both sides look on.
Wow.
That's no less horrific than the actual execution of individuals. It is the unfortunate result of warfare is that often the most vulnerable are used as you know, I hate to use the word pawns, but for a medieval, you know, view of warfare, maybe not in apropos, but are often used as the tools for gaining whatever end you want in that conflict. Medieval leaders certainly didn't balk at the death of individuals if they felt that was necessary for their military gains. So whether Richard didn't want to feed them, whether he didn't want to give Saladin more time to build up an army, whether he knew that these negotiations were not going to go anywhere and that he couldn't completely back off and lose all credibility, any one of those results could have, in his mind, been worthy of the death of these hostages.
What's interesting is, though, Andrew, is that it's all been forgiven by Saladin. And then, I mean, I'm probably going to talk about it. They became best buddies, really. And then
yeah, or at least collegial.
Yeah.
Like, hey, you're...
Well, I mean, he was trying to give his sister away, right?
Yeah, there's some very interesting debates back and forth. I wasn't going to go too long and deep into that, but they are wonderful. And Saladin sending him ice sherbet when Richard is ill, and yeah, there's whether they had ceased their military conflict at that point and were trying to go for the graciousness conflict, or whether they truly had this relationship, built of their shared work against each other. That I can't answer, but they both play the game very, very well, and are just really, really good at it. And you're absolutely right that Saladin does not hold this against him, and this is what happens to medieval hostages when the criteria isn't met. They're not prisoners of war as we tend to think of prisoners of war today, where we even the idea of Geneva Convention and that there's certain expectations of what happens to a prisoner of war has not necessarily been the reality for a very long time. But these aren't prisoners of war. These are medieval hostages. The rules are different.
Interesting. So Andrew, we have a couple of choices here. I love this presentation. This is amazing, and it's so detailed, and we're learning so much. We could do this. We can, maybe in a couple of weeks or a month time, whatever you decide, we can continue this and maybe roll over into another crusade. Or what I'm also interested is in Edward. The beginning of Plantagenets, all that stuff. That is so interesting. I was reading about it. I was like, why did we jump on a John and Richard, but without knowing the story of Plantagenets? We got to know that story. We got to know. It's like a war of, Game of Thrones, if you think of it. It's crazy.
I absolutely. Well, and even, if you want Game of Thrones, you got to go to the War of the Roses. That is totally Game of Thrones right there. But I saw it when I cut my teeth in medieval history on Edward I, particularly in the Welsh campaigns. So I'm always happy to talk about Edward. But if you give me 10 minutes, we'll at least come to Jerusalem and wrap up Richard's story. And then if you want to, you can always get me to talk forever, but sadly, I am going to have to be functional for work tomorrow. So I do want to wrap up within 10, 15 minutes or so, but I am always happy to come back and talk history.
Yeah, please, by all means. It's a great presentation, Andrew. So yeah.
Thank you so much.
Definitely would like to hear and to get more of it.
And I love my medieval history, but I can also talk 19th century America or a bunch of different stuff. So
we'll get to that too.
I prefer medieval one.
Definitely,
it is my newer passion, is rekindling my medievalist studies. All right. So the absolute pinnacle of Richard and Saladin's military campaigns is the Battle of Arsuf, and what Richard is able to do at Arsuf is build an army that's able to use discipline to defeat the hit and run tactics that his Islamic foes use. Generally, you have medieval armies broken into different segments known as battles. This is no different. In this case, the advanced guard, the first battle that's leading Richard's forces as they march toward Jerusalem, and he's marching along the coast. He's using ships to provide supplies. Richard knows that his most effective combat strength is in his mounted knights. They're also, in many ways, very vulnerable to the storm of arrows that his Islamic foes use on the battlefield. Horses, by and large, are not armored at this point. The image is from later, as many of these are. And so the horses themselves are particularly vulnerable to bow fire, which is the specialty of Saladin's army. And so what Richard does is he marches his army along the coast with his knights on the shoreline, essentially. and his infantry inland, using his infantry as a screen for his mounted forces, with everybody keeping discipline and keeping tight ranks so that they can use shield and armor and formation against the bow fire of his opponents. So this is not like movie bow fire or even 100 Years' War, longbow, warbow, bow fire. The shorter recurve bows used by the Islamic armies were not by and large able to penetrate the more effective armor. So if you had your infantry forces in mail, in formation with their shields, they were surprisingly resilient as long as they didn't break their formation. When you have a mounted force, if your enemy breaks, if you can get a horse in the line, you can crack a line with mounted combat. And so Richard is able to keep his troops very tightly packed. And when Saladin chooses to actually try open battle at Arsuf, essentially Richard's foot soldiers hedgehog up behind their spears in ranks, and his mounted forces are then held in reserve behind them. His advance guard had been led by the Templars. His rear guard had been held by the Hospitallers, using his military orders, the most professional of his forces, as the two ends. It's going to be the Hospitallers who, whether they are ordered to, whether they see advantage or whether they flinch first, who launch the mounted charge first. And what Richard does is when that charge goes off, he is going to throw his entire weight behind it and throw the rest of his mounted forces into it. And he solidly defeats Saladin's army in open warfare. Saladin is forced to pull back, give some breathing space. Richard is actually going to be able to march his troops to within sight of Jerusalem. But Richard also knows that Philip is back in France, possibly causing trouble. And I think Richard, who really specialized in the logistics of warfare, also truly understood that he probably could capture Jerusalem, but he probably could not hold it. And so what he's going to end up doing, and there's a little bit of denouement, there's some fighting. Jaffa is captured by Saladin and Richard recaptures it. But essentially, Richard and Saladin are going to create a peace treaty. Jerusalem is going to be opened for pilgrims who want to visit the holy sites with no persecution, and then are allowed to leave. And Richard is going to essentially pack it up and go home. And he'll leave the Holy Land in 1192. It is going to be 1194 before he makes it back to England, because along the way he's going to be shipwrecked, and who happens to gain control of him but Leopold of Austria, who is in no mood to let Richard off without any consequences. And then we get, of course, the story of the ransoming of Richard, which, you know, we often think, thanks to our Robin Hood terms, of this being a fairly short period. It's 2 years that he's held before the ransom is paid. And as romantic as it is to think that his troubadour wondered until he heard Richard singing in the tower and knew that that's where his liege has been kept, if you're going to ransom a king, it doesn't do you any good if you don't tell everybody that they need to pay you. And so it was pretty quickly, the information got out pretty quickly when Richard had been captured. It's an interesting question. Would Richard have come back to the Holy Land had he managed to tie things up in England and France after Saladin had died? I think it's actually probably doubtful that he would ever have patched things up well enough in England to feel that comfortable in leaving again. The same, he manages to, Philip does a lot of damage in the period while Richard is being held in prison. But Richard is able to undo it pretty effectively once he's released. His brother will lose the rest of it later down the road. But they never sort of face off against each other again. We could spend, another good chunk of time looking into the messages that pass between Richard and Saladin at the end of the campaign, and that's fascinating as well. But I want to make sure that there's some time for questions and sort of wrap it up there. But yeah, if anybody has any questions or any sort of follow-ups.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, was it the Battle of Jaffa where he earned that name, Coeur de Lion or Lionheart, or was it some? I think it was the Holy Land. But
yes, there's a couple of different stories as to when he gets it, but both Saladin and I should have said Saladin and Coeur de Lion throughout the whole. You've used both of their sobriquets throughout the entire presentation. Both of them have their names during their lives. So many of these leaders get what they're known, that ringing title after they've died or later in history. But they're contemporary for both of them. So another sort of commonality that they have. But yes, it is during the Holy Land that the Coeur de Lion is coined. It certainly becomes very popular later. Richard, particularly in the Victorian period, Richard becomes a model in England. They sort of appropriate him to European colonialism in the Victorian era, and that idea of Victorian manhood. Richard is a sort of nice showy topic for that, and the Lionheart builds from there. But it was a contemporary name.
Yeah, he's considered one of the better English kings, would you say? He's certainly popular. He's come under a lot of criticism recently, partially so in history. Coming up with a new angle to look at a historical event is how you get your dissertation. And it's worthwhile, because if we look at something really hard from a different angle and it doesn't stick, then that gives us, sort of more basis for what we make our decisions on. Richard, one of the challenges that both Richard and Saladin face today, and the reason that their legacy is awkward, is that they are very much used as figureheads in tensions between Christianity and Islam, or Christianity in the Middle East, or tensions in general in the Middle East today, outside of their historic context. And that's what we do with historic figures. But that's been true for a very long time. I mean, you have when the British Army in World War I takes Jerusalem, the British commander is drawn in political cartoons wearing the armor of Richard I. So this isn't a new thing. Even in World War I, those connections are very much made. I think on the whole, Richard is arguably the pinnacle of the medieval warrior king. There are kings that had far better administrations for their people. There are kings that could be renowned for other skills. But if you're looking for a warrior king, it is hard to do much better than Richard I. Soundly the best military mind in Western Europe at the time. I think it's hard to dispute that. He understood logistics, he understood tactics, he understood discipline, knowing his enemy, when to attack, when to besiege. He did all of that very, very well. If he lacked anything, it was maybe knowing when to put armor on. And so, from that angle, Richard is a very successful medieval king. And being a warrior king was part of being a medieval king. Neither John nor
Henry III are good warrior kings, and England suffers for it. Edward I will change that a bit. But one of the problems that warrior kings find is that in order for their systems and their kingships to continue to be successful, the entire kingdom has to support going to war and conflict. And so there's a strain on England during Richard's reign to support his crusade. Edward I reinvents English finances in order to support conflict. And even that is strained and falling apart by the end. So there's consequences to being a warrior king. But I think on the whole, he seemed to have been a popular king in his time. And I think he's a good model for if you're looking for that true warrior king. Although Philip was no slouch. Now, Philip was not the frontline warrior that Richard was. He was not as an effective a personal warrior, but he also very sharply understood when to wage war, when not to, how to build alliances, who to use when in conflict, and arguably was better at the diplomatic and political intrigue than Richard was. Although I enjoy making a little bit of fun of John for losing England. Most English kings, other perhaps than Richard, would have been hard pressed to defeat Philip Augustus and the Capetians in France. He was a really, really good military, if not warrior king for France.
Question on Richard and John. I guess I like the Prince John was a very severe, rapacious tax collector, and the people were eagerly awaiting the arrival home of the more benevolent Richard.
I mean, Richard
whereas
was
I
a
gather
severe, rapacious tax collector who was popular.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So Prince John was unfairly maligned for being a rapacious tax collector, I understand.
To be fair, John does some good while Richard is away crusading, plays his cards well and becomes pretty popular, because the regent that Richard leaves behind is not popular. And there's a lot of conflicts with the leading barons over his rule. And John sort of comes in as hey, let's smooth this all out. We'll remove the regent and we'll get things working. And sort of builds up some good alliances and does some good work during that period. It's one of John's better moments as a ruler. It's when Richard is captured and ransomed that John goes off the chain and tries to take over and makes really, really bad deals with Philip.
I think the ransom money disappeared at some point, right? He tried to, was it on purpose? He tried to delay it? Something like that?
John definitely tried to delay it. He actually tried to, both he and Philip essentially asked okay, so they got the ransom. Can you increase what your demand is? It didn't go through. As far as actually interfering with the funds, I don't believe so. John would not have been, by that point, John has been sidelined again in terms of control of the realm. John comes in for a brief moment, seems to be doing good things. Everybody kind of likes him. And then he does some of the things that John does. He overreaches a little bit. And then when Richard's captured, he starts to overreach too much. And the leading barons sort of pull back from John, and partially with the help of Eleanor of Aquitaine. Never underestimate Eleanor of Aquitaine. She is largely responsible for assembling and getting the ransom over to the Holy Roman Empire. I really wish it would be amazing if we had more sources from her point of view, because most of our sources are from the point of view of all of the men she influenced. But she's got 2 French kings and multiple English kings who she was directly connected to or married to or mother of during this period.
She was a French queen before it became English.
Yep.
That's amazing. Okay.
And if we're gonna, I'll do 2 last medieval movie points. If although it is not factually correct, the movie and stage play Lion in Winter, I think does a really nice job of capturing the personalities of Henry and Eleanor and their children. And plus just some great one-liners as well. So I highly recommend.
Yeah, I love the movie.
I adore that
Of
movie.
course, yeah, Peter O'Toole and
Katharine Hepburn and
Katharine
yes.
Hepburn, yes. of
Timothy
course.
Dalton as Philip, who just does a great job as Philip, a young,
Right.
very young
And
Timothy Dalton
Anthony Hopkins
as
plays,
Richard.
Richard, yeah. Yeah, amazing.
Timothy
cast.
Dalton that played 007.
Yeah,
That's what
Yeah.
I say.
yeah, he plays Philip of France, and just beautiful, like him and Peter O'Toole interacting with each other as the young French king and the old. Oh, it's great. The dialogue is just beautiful in that movie. It's wonderful. I love it. It does play on the trope, and you can't talk about Richard without at least mentioning the accusations of homosexuality. They are not contemporary to Richard's lifetime. In the medieval world, they knew homosexuality. Had that been the case, it would have been used against him at the time. It certainly was against Edward II. And of course, this isn't, I'm not making judgments in any way, shape, or form. There are accounts of Richard having his opponents' wives and daughters carried off to act as his concubines. So that concept seems to come out of a 20th century misreading of what the concept of sleeping in the same bed with another man actually means. Not uncommon in the era before central heating for people to share beds, because it's a whole lot warmer when people share beds without thinking anything of it. So it at least bears mentioning that's probably a misunderstanding of sources.
Yeah, but Edward II was pretty open, right, with the Gaveston.
I mean, his affection was certainly open. You can always debate what that affection was caused by, but he was certainly the understanding at the time is that they had a relationship, as did whether or not Edward II was executed with a red hot poker up the anus. That's
You don't believe that?
Ooh.
Yeah.
Whether or not that's true, it certainly gained enough currency to very shortly after his death become the story.
Eleanor.
No, Isabel the
Isabella.
Fair. Isabel
yeah.
the Fair.
Yeah.
I mean,
It was-
they found that they strangled him, right? It wasn't anything like that, and they made it so.
I believe that is absolutely correct, but the story really gained purchase, and stories like that don't often gain purchase because there's connections that can be made. So the last movie piece that I will make, and this is if you look at any of the sort of the history myth busting stuff out there for the Kingdom of Heaven, often the accusation is made that the movie couldn't possibly have the medieval mind correct because Balian as a bastard is made Baron of Ibelin. So there's a lot of reasons why Kingdom of Heaven gets the medieval mind wrong. That's not one of them necessarily. Although the idea that a bastard could not necessarily inherit a title was out there, it certainly wasn't solid. because John's illegitimate brother, John of Salisbury, John Longsword, is made Earl of Salisbury. If you're in a high enough noble family,
Yeah.
you are accepted as part of that family in this time period. Even as a bastard, you still could gain a title.
Yeah.
Um,
Definitely.
but I've seen that one pointed out as a problem in Kingdom of Heaven, and I kind of scratched my head. It's like there's a lot of things you could pick out of Kingdom of Heaven to pick on. That's actually probably not the one I would have chosen.
You know, it's
I
like-
know the video you're talking about. You're talking about a YouTube channel called History Buffs, right?
Yes.
And- yeah. I like that.
Oh, and I love his stuff. No, I love
Yeah.
History Buffs.
Me too.
I think he does great stuff. But that one point, it was like, well, yeah, but not yet.
Yeah.
50 years later, you'd be right, but not yet.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, listen, Andrew, this was amazing. A lot of good graphics, very, very informative. We all enjoyed it. Everybody had so much good things to say. I appreciate. I hope we'll be in contact about Edward when you want to do it. Maybe
Absolutely.
next month or this month or whatever you want.
Give me backstory. I work in education, and we've got students coming back into buildings, and I run standardized testing for my building because I was asked to, not because I want to. So my life for the next month is going to be stressful.
Right. Okay.
So give
Where are
me
you
a little
from?
more time.
Where-
I live in Maryland.
Oh, okay. All right, Maryland.
Very nice.
Cool.
Yeah. All right. So I'll push something to May then, May or something like that. Or,
That would be great.
Yeah. But because we enjoy, this is the second one you did, and English themes are just amazing, and on other topics as well. I mean, and then if you want to do something for Americas, whatever any kind of wars, let me know as well. I mean, that would be interesting as well.
It's whatever people are interested in. I just like talking history.
And maybe,
Oh, yeah.
maybe
We're all interested in this.
And unfortunately, in my professional career, no longer being in the classroom, I moved up to leadership and coordination, and making sure good instruction was happening across the board, which is great, and I love doing it. But I no longer get to talk history with people every day. So.
yeah, I mean, this is what we do here. This is all for joy and enjoyment, and again, I appreciate coming in, and I hope everything works out with difficult schedule, and again, thank you.
My absolute pleasure.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. That was
Thanks,
great.
Andrew.
Have a good night, all.
Yeah, thank you. Take care.
Hope to
Thanks
see you
a
all.
lot.
All right.
All right. Bye.